Try this one. We'll start by redrawing. Don't just redraw the picture. Redraw the electron pushing arrows as well. Draw big pictures with plenty of space. Double check on a complicated drawing like this to make sure that you've redrawn totally accurately. If there's any doubt, use numbers so you can establish reference points and step by step compare the two pictures. Now we'll go to the initial tail. This is coming from the pi bond, so we're going to erase that pi bond. I shouldn't have erased that tail yet. I'm not going to erase the tail until I've changed the charge as well. The charge is the most important part. Well, what was the atom that was at the tail here? Well, the atom at the tail is this one over here. Not this one. This is already in the middle of the string of arrows. This is at the tail. This is not at the tail either. This is not near any arrows. This is the one at the tail. So this atom over here is starting neutral and losing electrons, so it's becoming positive. Now I'm entitled to erase the tail. This head indicates we're forming a pi bond. Now we're in the middle of the string of arrows. No need to worry about changing the charges. I can erase the head. This tail is coming from the pi bond, so I'll erase that pi bond. No need to worry about charges. Erase the tail. This head is creating a pi bond. Draw the pi bond. No need to worry about charges. Erase the head. This tail is coming from the pi bond. Erase the pi bond. Still no need to worry about charges. Erase the tail. Now we're at the final head. Now this head is not pointing directly at an atom. If it was pointing directly at an atom, we'd form a lone pair. Instead, the head is pointing to the bond. Make sure that your drawing is big enough that it's ultra clear where the head is pointing. So we're forming this pi bond. And now I'm not entitled to erase this head yet. This is the final head, so I've got to change the charge here as well. This is the atom at the final head. Not this one down here. This was in the middle of the string of arrows. This is at the final head. This is not at the final head. There's no arrows close to it. This is the atom at the final head. It started with a positive charge, and it's gaining electrons. So it ends up neutral. And I can erase that arrow. Now we have to check the net charge. Here we have a net positive 1 charge. Here we have a net positive 1 charge. So those balance. What would we do if we ever got to a case where the net charges didn't balance? If the net charges didn't balance, that would mean we screwed up. If you did the resonance structures correctly, the net charges should always balance. If you ever find a new resonance structure that does not have the same total charge as the previous one, you made a mistake, and then you better go back and see where your mistake was. Notice that this pi bond had no arrows coming from it and no arrows going to it. So it's totally unchanged. We only make the changes that are forced by the electron pushing arrows. And similarly, this chlorine didn't play any role in going from one resonance structure to another. Remember that if you're getting these problems wrong, it's probably because instead of carefully redrawing and modifying, you might be just trying to draw the new picture from scratch. Well, when you just try to draw things from scratch, you tend to make changes you shouldn't and not make changes you should. So if you're having any trouble with this, use the redraw and modify technique. Try this example. As always, I hope that you paused the video and gave the problem a shot. Now let's go through it together. We begin by redrawing the original picture. Now let's make one modification at a time. We begin at the initial tail. Here's the initial tail. So this initial tail is coming from this negative charge on this carbon. We know that means that we're moving a lone pair. Since the lone pair wasn't drawn, we don't need to erase it. Because we're at the initial tail, we need to change the charge. This carbon began with a negative charge, and it's at a tail, so it's losing electrons. So it should become neutral. So we erase that charge. And we always erase each part of an arrow once we've accomplished all the changes required by that part of the arrow. We've dealt with the tail of this arrow, so we erase the tail. Now we haven't dealt with the head of the arrow yet, so we don't erase the head. So as you've seen on many examples now, I actually encourage you to erase the arrows part by part. Deal with the tail of the arrow, and then just erase the tail. Then deal with the head of the arrow, and then just erase the head. That helps you to be meticulous and make sure that you're making the changes that you need to. The head of this arrow is pointing to the middle of the sigma bond, which indicates that we form a pi bond. We need to draw the pi bond. Since we're in the middle of the string of arrows, we don't need to change any charges. Now we can erase the head of this arrow. We go to the next tail, which is coming from the pi bond. So we erase the pi bond. And we're not changing any charges. Erase the tail. This head indicates the creation of a pi bond. No charges to change. Erase the head. This tail indicates that we're moving the pi bond. We erase the pi bond. And there's still no charges to change, so we can erase that tail. Now we're at the final head. Now this arrow is pointing directly at this atom. We know that that means we're not making a pi bond, we're making a lone pair. We don't usually draw lone pairs, but since we're at the final head, we have to change a charge. This carbon is starting neutral and it's gaining electrons, so it must get one step more negative, which would give it a negative charge. And now we can erase that head. And then this is the correct resonance structure dictated by those arrows. Did you remember to check the net charges? I hope that you're checking the net charges on every single example. The net charge in this left-hand example is -1, and the net charge on the right-hand example is -1. So that balances. What would we do if the net charges were ever different? Well, that would mean that we must have made a mistake when we were drawing the resonance structures. So make sure that the net charges are the same. That's an indication that we haven't made a mistake. Well, this is a fairly complicated resonance structure here. Some people might get this wrong. Some people might make the wrong changes and get this wrong. Why would they get this wrong? Well, what's the method that we're using to get this right? Remember that the method that we're using is working with one part of an arrow at a time and making the changes required by that part of the arrow and then moving on to the next part of the arrow. But that's not the way that most students draw resonance structures. What technique do most people use? The technique that most people use is the draw what feels good technique. I think most beginning students just draw what feels good. They look at the arrows and they get a kind of feel or gestalt for where the new bonds are going to be and the new charges, and they just kind of draw in what feels good. Well, that doesn't work very well for beginning students. So you can see we're not using the feel good technique. We are working with one part of an arrow at a time and making the exact changes required by each part of the arrow. So if these problems are giving you any trouble, again, the technique that you don't want to use is the just draw what feels good technique. Instead, follow the example that we've been giving. Now, eventually, when you've done so much practice, you actually will have a feel for how the arrows work, and then you won't need to be so meticulous. You could, once you're comfortable with this, you actually can draw what feels good, and since you'll have a feel for the material, what feels good will actually be correct. So that's great. If you're already at that point, that's great. But again, I'm intending these videos for people who are finding this material difficult. Well, if you find the material difficult, you probably don't have a very good feel for it, and that means that you should not yet just be drawing what feels good. Instead, you should be making the changes that are dictated by each part of the arrow, working with one part of an arrow at a time, and slowly moving your way along until you've made all the necessary changes.